a wedding day, the moment every girl dreams of. For Evelyn Vance, it was supposed to be the beginning of her fairy tale, marrying the dashing billionaire Damien Blackwood. She was radiant, she was in love, and she was carrying his child. But in front of hundreds of their wealthiest friends and family, the fairy tale shattered. With one swing of his hand, her prince became a monster, and her dream became a public nightmare. What could a pregnant bride do at that moment? Nothing. But what her quiet, unassuming father did next, it didn't just get justice. It brought an entire empire to its knees and exposed a secret so dark the entire hall was left in stunned, horrified silence. This isn't a story about heartbreak. It's a story about the devastating power of a father's revenge. The air in the grand ballroom of the Astor Grand Hotel didn't just shimmer. It hummed with the palpable energy of old money and new power. Lilies and white roses imported from the Netherlands cascaded from every surface, their cloying sweetness mixing with the scent of expensive perfume and the faint, crisp aroma of chilled champagne. This was the wedding of the year, the union of Damien Blackwood, the 30-something wunderkind of private equity, and the ethereal Evelyn Vance. Evelyn stood in the bridal suite, a vision in a custom Vera Wang gown. The silk felt like a second skin, cool and heavy against her own. Her reflection showed a woman she barely recognized. Her light brown hair was swept into an intricate chignon, with delicate wisps framing a face made flawless by a celebrity makeup artist. But it was her eyes, a soft hazel, that held the truth. They were bright with a nervous excitement that bordered on anxiety. Her hand rested instinctively on the slight, barely there curve of her stomach. 4 months. 4 months carrying the heir to the Blackwood fortune. Her best friend and maid of honor, Chloe, adjusted a stray pearl pin. "You look breathtaking, Evelyn. Like stop the world on its axis breathtaking." Evelyn offered a weak smile. "I feel like I'm about to walk a tightrope over a canyon." "That's just normal wedding jitters," Chloe said, though her eyes held a flicker of something else, a concern she'd been nursing for months. "Just remember to breathe. And try not to trip. This dress probably costs more than my apartment building." The truth was, Evelyn's anxiety wasn't just about the wedding. It was about Damien. When they'd met a year ago at a charity gala, he had been everything she'd ever read about in novels. He was devastatingly handsome, with eyes the color of a stormy sea and a smile that could disarm world leaders. He'd pursued her with a relentless, all-consuming passion that had swept her off her feet. He'd showered her with gifts, whisked her away to Paris on a whim, and made her feel like the only woman in the world. But there was another side to Damien, a side that emerged when the doors were closed. It started small, a suggestion about what she should wear, a dismissive comment about her friends, especially Chloe, whom he deemed unambitious. He'd streamlined her life, convincing her to leave her job as a gallery assistant to focus on their future. He'd isolated her not with bars, but with diamonds and silk. He called it protection love. But sometimes, late at night, it felt like ownership. The pregnancy had intensified everything. He was ecstatic, but his control tightened. He monitored her diet, her schedule, even her phone calls. "It's for the baby, my love," he'd murmur, kissing her temple. "Our legacy must be protected. Evelyn, it's time." Her father, Arthur Vance, stood in the doorway. He was a man who seemed to take up less space than he should, of average height and build, with graying temples and a quiet demeanor. He looked utterly out of place amongst the titans of industry gathering below. A retired accountant from a mid-sized firm in Ohio, He was the picture of unassuming middle-class decency. He wore a simple, well-fitted tuxedo that still looked like a costume on him. "You look beautiful, sweetheart," he said, his voice soft, but his eyes, sharp and intelligent behind his glasses, held a universe of love and a sliver of the same worry Chloe couldn't hide. "Thanks, Dad." She hugged him, finding a momentary anchor in his familiar, steady presence. "Are you happy, Evelyn?" he asked, his voice low, meant only for her. It was the question he'd asked several times over the past few months. "I am," she lied, or perhaps willed it to be the truth. "Damien is a lot. But he loves me. And the baby." Arthur just nodded, his gaze lingering on her for a moment too long. He had never liked Damien. From their first meeting, Arthur's quiet observation had unnerved the billionaire. Damien had tried to impress him with talk of stock portfolios and acquisitions, but Arthur had simply asked him about his favorite book. Damien had laughed it off, but he couldn't answer. Arthur saw not a titan, but a hollow man. He'd warned Evelyn gently to be careful to not lose herself in the whirlwind. She had assured him she wouldn't. Now, standing here, Arthur Vance looked like a man holding a losing hand, waiting for the final card to be played. Downstairs, Damien Blackwood was adjusting his cufflinks. He was talking to his best man, Julian Croft, but his eyes were scanning the room, cataloguing every guest, every potential rival, every sycophant. His mother, Isabella Blackwood, a formidable woman, sculpted from ice and ambition, glided to his side. "Everything is perfect, Damien," she said, her voice a low purr. "The Carringtons are here. Senator Thompson just arrived. This isn't just a wedding. It's a coronation." "As it should be," Damien said, a smirk playing on his lips. "And the bride, on her way. Remember, darling," Isabella added, touching his arm, her manicured fingers like talons. "She is a beautiful little thing, but she is malleable. She is the vessel for the next Blackwood. Ensure she remembers her role." Damien's smirk tightened. "Don't worry, Mother. She knows exactly what she is. She's mine." As the grand doors to the ballroom opened and the first notes of the bridal march began to play, Evelyn took her father's arm. The sea of faces turned towards them, a blur of wealth and influence. At the end of the aisle, Damien was waiting, his handsome face lit with a triumphant smile. To the world, he was the prince welcoming his bride. But to Evelyn, for a fleeting, terrifying moment, the grand hall felt less like a church and more like a beautiful, inescapable cage. Walking down the aisle felt like floating through a dream. Hundreds of pairs of eyes were on her, their gazes a physical weight. The flash of a professional photographer's camera, the soft rustle of silk and chiffon from the pews, the soaring notes of the string quartet. It all merged into a sensory overload. Evelyn focused on one thing only, the man waiting for her under a breathtaking arch of woven branches and starlit orchids. Damien's eyes devoured her as she approached. He looked every bit the modern-day Adonis in his Tom Ford tuxedo. When she reached the altar, he took her hand. His grip was firm, possessive. He leaned in his lips, brushing her ear. "You are perfect, Mrs. Blackwood to be." He whispered the words, a possessive claim rather than a compliment. "I knew the world would be jealous." The ceremony, officiated by a retired judge who was a long-time family friend of the Blackwoods, was a masterclass in elegant pomp. The words washed over Evelyn in a haze. It was only when it came time for the vows that reality sliced through the fog. Damien went first. He had written his own, of course. He spoke without notes, his voice resonating with practiced sincerity. "Evelyn." He began, his stormy eyes locked on hers. "Before you, my life was a series of transactions of acquisitions. I understood the value, but not the worth. I understood power, but not strength. You, my love, have taught me the difference. You are the single greatest merger of my life, the one asset I will protect above all others. I vow to build an empire for you, for our child, a fortress to keep you safe and cherished. I vow that you will never want for anything, and that the name Blackwood will be your shield and your crown. I am yours, irrevocably." A collective sigh rippled through the audience. It was poetic, powerful. But to Evelyn, and perhaps to her father, standing stoically in the front row, the words sounded cold. Transactions, acquisitions, asset, fortress. It wasn't the language of love. It was the language of a takeover. Now it was her turn. She had prepared vows as well, simple and heartfelt, filled with promises of shared laughter and mutual support. But as she opened her mouth, Damien subtly squeezed her hands. A signal. They had discussed this. He had suggested she use the vows his mother had helped draft. He'd said it was about presenting a united front. At the time, she'd acquiesced, wanting to avoid a fight. Now it felt like a gag. Her voice trembled slightly as she recited the polished, impersonal words. "Damien, I stand here today to join my life with yours. I vow to honor the legacy of the Blackwood name, to be a worthy partner in your endeavors, and to create a home that is a testament to our success. I will stand by you, support your vision, and dedicate myself to our family. I offer you my loyalty, my fidelity, and my heart today, and for all of our days." It was a speech fit for a corporate wife, not a soulmate. As she finished, she saw Chloe in the front row, her brow furrowed in confusion and disappointment. She saw her father, his expression unreadable, but his eyes filled with a deep, profound sadness. She had just publicly sworn her fealty. The reception that followed was even more extravagant. A 10-foot-tall champagne fountain dominated the center of the room. A jazz band played softly as waiters in white gloves served canapes of caviar and truffle-infused delicacies. The mood was jubilant, but a strange tension coiled beneath the surface. Evelyn felt it every time Damien's hand found the small of her back, guiding her, steering her from one conversation with a banking CO to another with a tech mogul. He introduced her not as his wife, but as his prize. "This is my Evelyn," he'd say, a proud glint in his eye. "Isn't she stunning?" An hour into the reception, Evelyn felt a wave of nausea, a common symptom of her pregnancy that was amplified by the stress and the overwhelming scent of flowers. She excused herself, needing a moment of quiet. "I'll come with you," Damien said immediately, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "No, it's okay," she insisted, trying to sound breezy. "I just need some air. I'll be right back." His fingers tightened on her arm for a fraction of a second before he let go. "Don't be long. We have to cut the cake." Escaping the ballroom felt like breaking the surface of water after holding her breath for too long. She found a small, secluded balcony overlooking the city lights. The cool night air was balm. A moment later, a familiar voice said, hiding out. She turned to see Mark Renshaw, an old friend from her university art history program. He was a kind, gentle soul with a passion for impressionist painting. He worked as a curator at a small independent gallery, the kind of place Damien would scoff at. "Mark, "Oh my God, I didn't know you were here," Evelyn said, a genuine smile finally reaching her eyes. "My +1 cancelled last minute, and a friend of a friend works for Blackwood Global. It's a small world," he said with a shrug. "You look beautiful, Evelyn. Truly, but are you okay?" The simple, honest question was almost her undoing. The dam of her composure began to crack. "It's just a lot," she admitted, her voice dropping to a whisper. "More than I expected." "I get it," he said, leaning against the railing beside her. He didn't pry, didn't ask about her billionaire husband. He just started talking about their favorite professor, a disastrous road trip they once took to see a Monet exhibit, and the simple happy days that now felt a lifetime away. They laughed, and for 5 minutes, Evelyn felt like herself again. She wasn't an asset or a vessel. She was just Evelyn. She didn't see Damien approach. He moved with the predator's silence. One moment she was laughing at a memory. The next a chilling voice cut through the air. "Having a nice chat." Evelyn spun around. Damien stood in the doorway, his face a mask of cold fury. His eyes weren't on her. They were locked on Mark, a look of such utter contempt that Mark physically recoiled. "Damien, this is Mark, an old friend from college," Evelyn said quickly, trying to diffuse the palpable tension. "I know who he is," Damien said, his voice dangerously low. He took a step forward, invading their space. "The little curator. Tell me, Mark, what's the market rate for a failing gallery these days? I might buy it and turn it into a parking garage." Mark paled. "We were just catching up." "You were," Damien snarled, "touching my wife." "I wasn't." "I saw you," Damien interrupted, stepping directly in front of Mark. "You were making her laugh. That's my job now." He turned his icy gaze on Evelyn. "Our guests are waiting. We have a schedule to keep. Or have you forgotten your duties already?" The venom in his voice was terrifying. This was the Damien she feared, the one whose temper could flash like lightning from a clear blue sky. He grabbed her arm, his grip bruising. "Damien, you're hurting me," she whispered, her heart pounding. "Let's go," he ordered, pulling her back towards the ballroom, leaving a stunned and frightened Mark alone on the balcony. As they re-entered the dazzling light of the reception, Damien's face transformed. The rage vanished, replaced by his charming public smile. He was an actor, and this was his greatest performance. But Evelyn could still feel the phantom pain on her arm, and the cold dread coiling in her 4-month pregnant belly. The worst part of the night had not yet begun. The transition back into the ballroom was jarring. The moment they stepped through the doors, the buoyant energy of the party washed over them, a stark contrast to the venomous tension of the balcony. Damien's hand, which had been a vice on her arm, now rested gently on the small of her back, a gesture of loving possession for all to see. He leaned in his breath, warm against her ear, but his words were shards of ice. "Smile," he hissed, his voice inaudible to anyone else. "You look panicked. People will talk. Is that what you want on our wedding day? A scandal because you can't control yourself around your little art school boyfriend." Evelyn felt a chill snake down her spine. "He's just a friend, Damien. You're twisting this into something it's not." "What I'm doing," he whispered back, steering her toward the towering 11-tier wedding cake, "is protecting my investment. And right now, you're it. So play the part." Her heart hammered against her ribs. Investment. The word echoed the cold calculus of his vows. She felt dizzy, trapped under the weight of 1,000 pairs of eyes and the crushing reality of the man she had just married. They reached the cake. The photographer and videographer moved into position, their lenses like soulless eyes. The master of ceremonies, a jovial man named Bill, tapped a glass for attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, please, it is now time for the moment. We've all been waiting for the cutting of the cake by our handsome groom, Damien, and his beautiful bride, Evelyn." A polite ripple of applause went through the room. Damien was handed a silver cake knife with an ornate pearl-inlaid handle. He wrapped his hand around it and then placed his other hand over Evelyn's, guiding her to join him. His touch was cold. As they posed for the cameras, Damien's mother, Isabella, glided over. She smiled a brittle, perfect expression, but her eyes were flinty. "Damien, darling," that little scene on the balcony, was noticed by more than a few people. "What was that about?" "A minor issue, Mother." "Handled," Damien replied through a clenched jaw, his smile never wavering for the cameras. Isabella's gaze shifted to Evelyn, and it was filled with pure disdain. "You need to learn your place, dear. You are a Blackwood now. Your past associations are irrelevant. They reflect poorly on us." The condescension, the possessiveness, the public humiliation, it all coalesced into a single defiant spark within Evelyn. She had been silent for too long, placating his moods, accepting his control as a twisted form of love. But the mention of her pregnancy, the life she was carrying, made her find a sliver of courage she didn't know she possessed. She pulled her hand from under Damien's. It was a small gesture, but in the hyper-focused spotlight of the moment, it was a seismic shift. Damien's smile faltered for a second. "What are you doing?" he murmured, his voice a low threat. "I just need a glass of water," she said. Her own voice barely a whisper, but it was steady. She turned to move away from the cake. "We're cutting the cake now, Evelyn," Damien said, his tone hardening, the command clear. "It can wait 30 seconds, she replied, her back to him. She took a step towards the nearest waiter. It was that single step of defiance that broke him. His control, always a fragile veneer over a core of incandescent rage, shattered completely. In his mind, she wasn't just walking away. She was disobeying him. She was embarrassing him in front of his mother, his colleagues, his entire world. He moved faster than anyone could have anticipated. He grabbed her shoulder, spinning her around to face him. His handsome face was contorted into a mask of pure fury. "You will do as you are told." He spat, his voice no longer a whisper. And then he did the unthinkable. With an open palm, Damien Blackwood slapped his pregnant wife across the face. The sound was not loud, but in the expectant hush of the room, it was like a gunshot. A sharp, ugly crack that sliced through the music, the chatter, and the laughter. It echoed in the sudden, absolute silence that fell over the grand ballroom. For a moment, time froze. 1,000 guests, 100 waiters, an entire orchestra all stood as if turned to stone. Champagne flutes paused halfway to lips. Forks hovered over plates. The only sound was the quiet, horrified gasp that Evelyn let out more from shock than from pain. The sting on her cheek bloomed into a hot, throbbing ache. But it was nothing compared to the agony in her heart. She stared at Damien, her husband of less than 3 hours, and saw a stranger. The charming prince was gone, replaced by a monster with rage in his eyes. The room began to spin, the faces of the guests warping into a gallery of disbelief and horror. She saw Chloe, her hands covering her mouth, her eyes wide with terror. She saw Isabella Blackwood, whose expression was not one of shock, but of cold, calculating annoyance at the public spectacle. And then she saw her father. Arthur Vance had been standing near the edge of the dance floor. He did not shout. He did not run. He simply moved. He walked past the frozen statues of New York's high society with a calm, deliberate pace. His face was a blank slate, utterly devoid of emotion, which was somehow more terrifying than any expression of rage could ever be. He reached the raised platform, where Evelyn stood, trembling, one hand cradling her cheek, the other protectively on her stomach. He didn't even look at Damien. His eyes were only for his daughter. He gently took her arm. "Come on, sweetheart," he said, his voice the same quiet, steady tone he'd used her entire life. "We're leaving." Damien finally seemed to snap out of his rage-fueled trance, replaced by a dawning sense of panic. This was a public relations nightmare. "Now wait a minute, Arthur," Damien started, forcing a laugh. "It was just a misunderstanding, a lover's quarrel. We're all a bit emotional today." Arthur Vance stopped. He slowly turned his head, and for the first time that night, he looked Damien Blackwood directly in the eye. The quiet accountant from Ohio seemed to grow 10 feet taller. The air around him crackled with a silent, lethal intensity. "You will not speak to me," Arthur said, his voice still quiet, yet it carried across the silent hall like a judge's gavel. "And you will never ever speak to my daughter again." He started to lead Evelyn away, but Damien, desperate to regain control, grabbed his shoulder. "This is my wedding. You're not taking my wife anywhere." Arthur stopped again. He slowly, deliberately removed Damien's hand from his shoulder, as if he were disposing of something unclean. He looked at the hand, then back at Damien's face. "Your wife," Arthur said, a humorless smile touching his lips. "She is my daughter, and you, son, have just made the biggest mistake of your life. You think this is your stage, your audience." He gestured to the stunned crowd. "You have no idea what's about to happen." He then turned to the master of ceremonies, who was frozen by the cake table. "Bill, isn't it? I believe you have a microphone. I'd like to borrow it. I have a wedding toast I'd like to make." The master of ceremonies, Bill, a man paid handsomely to be jovial and unflappable, looked like a deer caught in the headlights of a freight train. He stared at Arthur, then at the furious face of Damien Blackwood, then back to the quiet, unassuming man, whose request felt more like a command. With trembling hands, he unclipped the wireless microphone from his lapel and handed it to Arthur Vance. Damien stepped forward, his face a thundercloud. "Security, get this man out of here!" 2 large men in black suits started to move from the periphery of the room, but they stopped dead when Arthur spoke into the microphone. His voice, now amplified, was still calm, but it filled every corner of the vast ballroom with an unnerving authority. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Damien," Arthur said, his eyes locking onto the billionaire's. "Because if your men lay a single hand on me, the email I have scheduled to be sent in exactly 10 minutes will go to the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the top 5 editors at the Wall Street Journal. Your choice." A collective gasp went through the room. This was no longer just a domestic dispute. The mention of the SEC and federal prosecutors changed the very air they breathed. Damien froze, his face draining of color. The security guards looked at him, awaiting orders. But he was silent, paralyzed. Arthur turned his back on Damien, a gesture of ultimate dismissal. He helped Evelyn, who was still in a state of shock, to a chair on the edge of the dance floor. Chloe rushed to her side, wrapping a protective arm around her. Arthur gave his daughter's shoulder a gentle squeeze, a silent promise, before he turned to face the audience of stunned elites. He stood in the center of the room, a simple man in a rented tuxedo, holding the attention of some of the most powerful people in the world. Good evening, everyone. He began, his tone conversational, as if he were about to start a quarterly budget meeting. My name is Arthur Vance. For most of you, I am a nobody, the quiet father of the bride, a retired accountant from Ohio. And for the most part, you are correct. I have spent the last 40 years of my life looking at numbers. Spreadsheets, balance sheets, income statements. It might sound boring to you. Most people's finances are. Predictable. Orderly. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room before it landed back on Damien. But Damien Blackwood's finances, they are anything but boring. They are a work of art. A complex, intricate, beautifully constructed fantasy. A nervous murmur rippled through the crowd. This was not a wedding toast. This was an execution. Isabella Blackwood stood up, her face a mask of cold fury. This is outrageous. He's spouting nonsense. Damien, do something. Damien took a hesitant step forward. He's delirious, grieving the loss of his daughter to a new family. It's understandable, but am I? Arthur interrupted, his voice cutting through Damien's feeble excuse. Let's talk about something specific. Let's talk about Project Nightingale. At the mention of those two words, at least a dozen people in the room visibly flinched. Julian Croft, the best man, looked as though he'd been punched in the gut. Damien's face went from pale to ghostly white. Arthur's voice was methodical, precise, and utterly damning. Project Nightingale, for those of you not on the Blackwood Global mailing list, was a revolutionary biotech venture that Blackwood Global acquired 2 years ago. It promised a groundbreaking Alzheimer's treatment. Damien hosted a special round of funding for it, bringing in over $200 million from many of you in this very room. He gestured vaguely with his free hand. The Carringtons, I believe you invested $10 million. Senator Thompson, your blind trust contributed $5. It was a sure thing, wasn't it? Backed by glowing lab results and projected FDA approval. He let the statement hang in the air before delivering the killing blow. The only problem is Project Nightingale never existed. The company Nightingale Biometrics was a shell corporation registered in Delaware. The lab results were fabricated by a disgraced researcher in Bolivia, and the $200 million. It wasn't invested in research. It was funneled through a series of offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and Panama, before being used to, among other things, artificially inflate Blackwood Global's fourth quarter earnings report, and of course to fund this very wedding. The silence in the room was now absolute, heavy, and suffocating. It was the silence of dawning financial ruin. You're lying, Damien finally roared, finding his voice. You have no proof. Proof, Arthur said, with that same chillingly calm smile. Damien, you seem to have a misconception about who I am. I told you I was an accountant. I suppose I omitted a few details. For the last 20 years of my career, I wasn't just any accountant. I was a forensic accountant. I worked for a very quiet, very discreet firm that was hired by governments and corporations to find things that people like you hide. They called me the Ghost because I could slip into a company's financials and find every skeleton, every ghost in the machine. I retired last year. He took a step closer to the stage. But when my daughter, my only child, told me she was marrying you, a man who seemed too polished, too perfect, I decided to come out of retirement for one last personal project. It's amazing what you can find when you know where to look. A sloppy wire transfer here, a falsified invoice there. You're brilliant at the big picture, Damien, the grand deception. But you're sloppy with the details. And the devil, as they say, is always in the details. Arthur raised his eyes to the large projection screens on either side of the ballroom, which were currently displaying a romantic photo montage of Evelyn and Damien. "And just in case my word isn't enough," Arthur said, pulling a small USB drive from his pocket, "I took the liberty of preparing a small presentation." He walked over to the AV technician, who was cowering behind his control board. "Son, plug this in for me. Would you display file Blackwood X?" The AV technician, a young man named Leo, who was being paid triple his usual rate for the high-profile gig, looked at Arthur, then at the apoplectic face of Damien Blackwood. For a moment, he was paralyzed by indecision. Damien was the client, the man who signed the checks. But the quiet man with the microphone held an aura of undeniable, terrifying authority. The threat of the SEC and federal prosecutors hung in the air like poison gas. Leo made a swift calculation of his future prospects and decided that siding with the billionaire, whose empire was actively imploding, was a poor career choice. With a shaky hand, he took the USB drive. "Which input, sir?" "The one that overrides the photo montage," Arthur said calmly. Damien lunged forward, trying to get to the tech booth. "Don't you dare, I'll ruin you. I'll have you blacklisted from every event in this city." But Julian Croft, the best man, stepped in his path. Julian's face was ashen, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and disgust. "Don't, Damien," he said, his voice low. "It's over." "Traitor!" Damien snarled, shoving him aside. But it was too late. The romantic photos of Damien and Evelyn vanished from the massive screens. They were replaced by something far less romantic, a complex flowchart. At the top, in a bold red box, were the words, "Blackwood Global Enterprises." Branching down from it was a dizzying web of shell corporations, offshore holding companies, and numbered accounts. Names like Apex Holdings Limited, Cayman, Viridian Solutions S.A. Panama, and Azure Trust Belize filled the screen. Arrows color-coded and annotated showed the flow of money. It looked like the battle plan for a financial invasion. "This," Arthur's amplified voice explained as he used a laser pointer from his pocket to direct the audience's attention, "is the real Blackwood Global. Not the one you see in the glossy annual reports, but the one that exists in the shadows." He clicked a button on a small remote, and the slide changed. It was a copy of a bank statement from Credit Suisse for an account under the name of Nightingale Biometrics. It showed an initial deposit of $200 million, followed by a series of large, rapid withdrawals to other accounts. "Here is the money from Project Nightingale." Arthur narrated his tone as dry as if he were explaining amortization. "Note the dates. The funds were dispersed within 72 hours of the last investment. Hardly the timeline for legitimate research and development." Click. The next slide showed a forged purchase order for laboratory equipment from a German company that, as a small annotation pointed out, had gone bankrupt 3 years prior. Click. An email chain between Damien and a man named Sergei Volkov, a known money launderer based in Cyprus. The subject line read "consulting fees." The guests were no longer just watching. They were captivated, horrified. Many were pulling out their phones not to record the drama, but to frantically text their own financial advisors. The air was thick with the smell of panic and betrayal. Damien was screaming now, a desperate, cornered animal. "It's fake. It's all fabricated. He's a bitter old man trying to destroy me." "Am I?" Arthur said, his voice unwavering. He advanced to the next slide. It was a satellite image of a lavish, half-built mansion on a private island in the Caribbean. "This is your contingency plan, isn't it, Damien? Your non-extradition paradise purchased under the name of a trust controlled by..." "Oh, this is interesting," He zoomed in on the document. The trustee's name was listed clearly: Isabella Blackwood. A collective gasp swept the room. Isabella, who had been watching with icy composure, finally broke. Her face contorted in a snarl of pure fury. "How dare you, you insignificant little man?" "I'm just an accountant, Mrs. Blackwood," Arthur said, without turning to look at her. "But I'm a very, very thorough one. You co-signed the transfer for the island property 2 weeks ago. I imagine you were planning a family vacation." He saved the most personal, most devastating blow for last. He clicked one final time. The screen showed a life insurance policy. It was for $25 million. The insured was Evelyn Vance. The beneficiary was Damien Blackwood. The policy was taken out the day after she had confirmed her pregnancy, and it contained a very specific clause. "This," Arthur said, his voice dropping, the calm finally cracking, to reveal the cold, hard rage beneath, "is a life insurance policy Damien took out on my daughter. Standard practice for some high-net-worth individuals. But this one has a rather peculiar rider. It pays out double in the event of an accidental death. It's amazing the kind of risks a pregnancy can introduce, isn't it? A fall down the stairs, a tragic car accident. So many possibilities." The implication was monstrous, a truly evil insinuation that hung in the silent room. Was the slap just a loss of temper, or the first crack in a much darker, more sinister plan? No one could be sure, but the seed of that horrific thought had been planted. Evelyn stared at the screen, her blood running cold. She thought of his obsessive control, his monitoring of her every move, his insistence that only his driver take her anywhere. She had thought it was overbearing love. Now she saw it in a horrifying new light. As if on cue, the grand doors of the ballroom burst open. But it wasn't more guests arriving. It was 4 stern-faced individuals in dark suits, 2 men and 2 women. They moved with the quiet efficiency of federal agents. One of them, a tall woman with sharp eyes, held up her badge. "Damien Blackwood, Isabella Blackwood. We're with the FBI. You need to come with us." The room erupted into chaos. The carefully constructed world of Damien Blackwood had not just been shaken. It had been systematically dismantled and utterly annihilated in the space of 15 minutes by a quiet accountant from Ohio. Arthur Vance lowered the microphone. His work was done. The ledger was balanced. The arrival of the FBI was like a lit match in a room full of gasoline. The quiet horror of the guests erupted into a cacophony of frantic whispers, clicking phones, and the scraping of chairs as people scrambled to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of the Blackwood family. Reporters who had been cordoned off outside must have gotten a tip because a flurry of flashes began to strobe through the ballroom's glass doors. Damien stood frozen, his face a grotesque canvas of disbelief, rage, and dawning terror. His empire, his reputation, his very identity had been publicly executed. He looked at the agents, then at the jeering, fearful faces of his guests, his former friends and investors, and finally his wild eyes landed on Evelyn. "You!" he shrieked, his voice raw and broken. "You did this! You and your pathetic old man!" He lunged toward her, a final desperate act of violence, but he never made it. The 2 male FBI agents intercepted him with professional ease, pinning his arms behind his back. The custom Tom Ford tuxedo ripped at the shoulder seam. "You're making it worse for yourself, Mr. Blackwood," one of the agents said calmly. Isabella Blackwood, however, did not scream or lunge. She was made of sterner, colder stuff. As the female agents approached her, she drew herself up to her full height, her expression one of pure aristocratic contempt. "Take your hands off me," she hissed. "Do you have any idea who I am?" "Yes, ma'am," the lead agent replied, her voice flat and unimpressed. "We have a warrant for your arrest on charges including conspiracy to commit wire fraud and money laundering. You have the right to remain silent." The sight of the formidable Isabella Blackwood being read her rights and handcuffed was for many in the room even more shocking than Damien's arrest. The matriarch, the queen bee of New York society, was being treated like a common criminal. The illusion of their untouchability was shattered forever. As the agents led the Blackwoods away, Damien continued to scream threats and curses. His carefully crafted persona stripped away to reveal the spoiled, vicious child beneath. In the midst of the chaos, Arthur Vance walked back to his daughter. He knelt before her, his hands gently taking hers. Her face was pale, stained with tears, her eyes wide with the trauma of the past hour. "It's over, Evelyn," he said softly. "It's all over. You're safe now." Chloe was on her other side, holding her, murmuring words of comfort. "He can't hurt you anymore. He's gone." Evelyn looked from her father's face to the chaotic scene of the crumbling party, then to the exit through which her husband, her abuser, had just been dragged away. A single heavy tear rolled down her cheek, a tear not of sadness, but of profound, gut-wrenching relief. It was the release of a year's worth of tension of fear she hadn't even let herself acknowledge. "How?" she whispered to her father. "How did you know all of this?" "I'll tell you everything," he promised, "but not here." He stood up and helped her to her feet. The magnificent Vera Wang gown, the symbol of her entry into the Blackwood dynasty, now felt like a costume from a horror movie. As they began to walk toward the exit, a path seemed to clear for them. The remaining guests parted like the Red Sea, their faces a mixture of pity, awe, and fear. They were looking at Arthur Vance, not as the bride's unassuming father, but as a giant slayer. As they passed the head table, Julian Croft, the best man, stepped forward. His face was etched with shame. "Mr. Vance," he said, his voice thick with emotion. I knew about some of it. The Nightingale Project. I suspected it was a sham. I didn't say anything. I'm so sorry, Evelyn." Arthur looked at him, his gaze analytical, not accusatory. "Some men are defined by their actions, Mr. Croft. Others by their inaction. You'll have to live with your choice." The U.S. Attorney's office will likely be in touch to see which man you want to be from now on. The words hung in the air, both a condemnation and a potential lifeline. Julian nodded, swallowing hard, and stepped back. With Chloe on one side and her father on the other, Evelyn walked out of the ballroom. She didn't look back at the 11-tier cake that would never be cut at the champagne fountain that had stopped flowing at the wilting Dutch roses, or at the ruins of her short, disastrous marriage. She walked out of the Astor Grand Hotel, leaving the gilded cage behind. The cool night air hit her face, and for the first time in a very long time she felt like she could breathe again. The future was uncertain and terrifying. She was pregnant, alone, and at the center of a massive scandal. But she was also free, and she was holding the hand of the man who had torn down an empire to give her that freedom. The father who had seen the monster behind the prince's smile and had quietly, methodically sharpened the blade of justice, waiting for the moment to strike. 2 months later, the autumn chill had settled over the city, stripping the leaves from the trees in Central Park. The scandal, dubbed the Blackwood implosion by the press, was still front-page news. Damien and Isabella Blackwood were out on a multi-million-dollar bail, their assets frozen, facing a mountain of federal charges. Their trial was set to be the legal spectacle of the decade. Dozens of investors had lost fortunes, and the domino effect had toppled two smaller hedge funds. Julian Croft had become the prosecution's star witness, his testimony securing him a plea deal and cementing the case against his former best friend. Evelyn was living in a quiet, sunlit apartment on the Upper West Side, a place her father had rented for her. It was modest compared to Damien's penthouse, but it felt more like a home than that sterile glass tower ever had. The Vera Wang dress was gone, donated anonymously to a charity. Her life was slowly being rebuilt, not on a foundation of wealth and power, but on one of safety and truth. She was sitting on a comfortable sofa, a mug of herbal tea warming her hands, watching the snow-dusted branches outside her window. Her baby bump was more pronounced now, a firm, reassuring presence. She was going to be a mother. The thought no longer terrified her. It filled her with a quiet strength. Arthur came in from the kitchen, handing her a plate of sliced apples. He had been staying with her since the wedding, a silent, steady guardian. "How are you feeling today?" he asked, sitting in the armchair opposite her. "Okay," she said, and for the first time it felt true. "I was just thinking, you never really told me how you did it. I mean, I know what you did, but how did you even know where to start looking?" Arthur sighed, settling back into his chair. "I told you, Evelyn. From the first time I met him, something felt wrong. People like Damien Blackwood, they don't build empires that quickly without cutting corners. They see rules not as boundaries, but as obstacles to be navigated or demolished. So I started looking. But how you are retired. Retirement gives a man a lot of free time," he said with a small smile. "I still have contacts, old friends at the IRS, a former colleague who now designs security software for major banks. I started with public records, property deeds, SEC filings. That's where I first saw the shell corporations. It was amateur stuff, really, but hidden behind a wall of legitimate-looking businesses. He was arrogant. He never thought anyone would look closely." He leaned forward, his expression serious. The key was Project Nightingale. When he announced it, the science sounded too good to be true. "I paid an independent biochemist, an old expert witness I used to work with, to review the prospectus. He said the data was impossible, that the results were statistically perfect, in a way that real-world science never is. That's when I knew it was a fraud. From there, it was just a matter of following the money." "You did all that for me?" Evelyn asked, her voice thick with emotion. Before the wedding." "I did it because you are my daughter," he said simply. "I hoped I was wrong. I prayed I was just a paranoid old man who didn't think anyone was good enough for his little girl. I compiled everything into a file, a sort of insurance policy. I never planned to use it. I thought maybe he'll be a good husband, a good father. Maybe his love for you will make him a better man." His eyes darkened with the memory of that night. "But when he put his hand on you, when I saw the look in his eyes on that balcony, I knew. And when he slapped you, he didn't just hurt you, Evelyn. He signed his own death warrant. He gave me the reason I needed to burn his whole world to the ground." "The FBI, Dad. How did you get them there so fast?" "An old friend from the U.S. Attorney's Office. I had sent him the preliminary file a week before the wedding under a strict embargo. I told him I had a source who would provide definitive, irrefutable proof of a massive Ponzi scheme at a specific time and place. I gave him the date and location of the wedding, I told him to have a team ready. He trusted me." Evelyn shook her head in awe. Her quiet, unassuming father was a strategic genius, a warrior who fought with spreadsheets and bank codes instead of swords. He had planned for every contingency. "The life insurance policy," she whispered. "Did you really think he would?" Arthur's face was grim. "I think a man who can hit his pregnant wife in front of 1,000 people is capable of anything when his back is against the wall. I wasn't willing to find out." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of what could have been hanging between them. Evelyn reached out and took her father's hand. "He's going to prison for a very long time," Arthur said. "He'll try to fight it, but the evidence is overwhelming. The Blackwood name will be nothing but a cautionary tale. You and this baby," he said, patting her hand. "You get to start fresh, with the Vance name. A name that may not be powerful or famous, but it's honest. It's built on something real." Looking at her father, at his kind, intelligent eyes, Evelyn understood. She had been seduced by a fantasy, a fairy tale built on lies. But she had been saved by a real, unconditional love. The love of a father who would go to war for his daughter. She placed a hand on her belly, feeling the gentle flutter of life within. This child would not be a Blackwood heir. They would be Vance, and they would be raised knowing the story of their grandfather, the quiet accountant who proved that the most dangerous man in the room isn't the one who shouts the loudest, but the one who reads the fine print. And so Evelyn's story wasn't an ending, but a new beginning forged from the ashes of a lie. It's a powerful reminder that true strength isn't found in billionaires' penthouses or lavish weddings, but in the unwavering love of family and the courage to stand up to abuse, no matter how powerful the abuser seems. The world of Damien Blackwood was built on sand, and a single righteous storm washed it all away. What do you think about Arthur's meticulously planned revenge? Was it pure genius, or did he go too far? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you, please give this video a thumbs up and share it with someone who might need to hear it. Stories like this deserve to be told. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss another incredible real-life drama. Thank you for listening. The air in New York's most exclusive restaurant, Aurelia, was usually thick with the scent of money and truffle oil. But tonight it was choked with fear, because Damien Al-Jamil had arrived. He wasn't just a millionaire. He was a titan, a predator who moved through the world as if he owned it, leaving a wake of crushed competitors and broken men. Every captain of industry, every senator, every person of influence in that room either worked for him, owed him, or feared him. His power was absolute, his temper legendary. And in that gilded court of ambition, a young waitress named Clara Evans, invisible to men like him, was about to do the unthinkable. She was about to make the lion look like a fool. The whisper started at the valet stand and slithered through the restaurant like a cold draft. "He's here." It didn't need a name. There was only one he who could silence the clatter of silver on porcelain and replace the confident hum of power with the taut silence of apprehension. Damien Al-Jamil did not walk into a room. He conquered it. He was a man sculpted from harsh desert winds and hardened by the cold steel of Wall Street. Though he carried a Western name, his lineage traced back to the formidable merchant princes of the Old World, a fact he wielded with the same precision as his vast fortune. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a custom Tom Ford suit, the the color of a midnight sky, and his eyes, dark and piercing, missed nothing. They were the eyes of a hawk that saw the field, the rabbit, and the rabbit's final terrified heartbeat all at once. Tonight he was dining with Senator Marcus Thorne, a man who was publicly a pillar of democracy but privately a puppet whose strings were pulled tight in Damien's fist. They were seated at table 1, the restaurant's throne, a semicircular booth of plush crimson leather that offered a panoramic view of the dining room and, more importantly, ensured everyone in the dining room had a view of them. Frank Marino, the restaurant manager, personally oversaw the service. His usual boisterous Italian charm had evaporated, replaced by a sheen of nervous sweat on his brow. The 1982 Petrus chilled to exactly 65 degrees, Mr. Al-Jamil. Frank said, his voice a little too high. And the beluga caviar, of course. Damien didn't even look at him. He waved a dismissive hand, his attention fixed on the senator. The votes are secured, Marcus. Don't bore me with the details. Just ensure the Commerce Committee understands that my logistics division requires deregulation, complete deregulation. Damien, some of the environmental reports are, the senator began, his voice weak. Are irrelevant. Damien finished, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. The air temperature around the table seemed to drop with it. The Earth has been here for billions of years. My port expansion project will be finished in 3. The planet will survive. He finally turned his gaze on Frank. Is there a problem with the service tonight, Frank? You seem to be hovering. No, sir. Not at all, Mr. Al-Jamil. My apologies. Frank practically scurried away, his face pale. From across the room near the service station where she was polishing wine glasses, Clara Evans watched the scene unfold. She was 24, a student at the Pratt Institute, working at Aurelia 3 nights a week to pay for her art history degree and the rent on her tiny Brooklyn apartment. To Damien Al-Jamil, she was less than a ghost, a functional cog in the machine that served him. But Clara was an observer. It was the core of her nature as an artist. She didn't just see people. She saw the posture beneath the suit, the flicker of fear behind the smile, the subtle tells of a lie. She saw the way Senator Thorne's hand trembled slightly as he reached for his water glass. She saw the way Frank, a man who usually commanded his restaurant with the authority of a general, seemed to shrink by 6 inches in Damien's presence. She had seen this performance before. Damien Al-Jamil was a regular, and his visits were like royal inspections. He would find a flaw. A wine served a degree too warm. A steak cooked medium. Instead of the medium rare, he'd ordered a perceived slight from a staff member, and he would exploit it. Not with shouting, which would be too common, but with a cold, surgical precision that left his victim utterly dismantled. He'd once had a sommelier fired on the spot for recommending a wine he deemed pedestrian. The man, a renowned epert named Charles, had simply vanished from the New York culinary scene afterward. Damien's power extended far beyond the walls of Aurelia. Clara, table 1 needs their water refilled, whispered Maria, another waitress, her eyes wide with anxiety. I don't want to go over there. The last time he said my perfume was an assault on his senses. I wasn't wearing any. Clara nodded, her expression calm. I'll take it. She wasn't brave, not in the traditional sense. She was terrified of him just like everyone else. But her fear was overshadowed by a deep, simmering resentment for the kind of casual cruelty he embodied. Her world was one of passion for history and beauty, of struggling to create something meaningful. His was a world of demolition, of treating people like disposable assets. As she approached the table with a pitcher of chilled water, her movements were fluid and professional. a mask of calm she had perfected. She moved to the senator's side first, refilling his glass without a sound. Then she moved to Damien's. He was in the middle of a monologue, gesturing with a hand that wore a Patek Philippe watch worth more than her entire college tuition. Authenticity, you see, Marcus. That is the only currency with any real value. Anyone can buy a copy. Anyone can buy a business. But to possess something truly singular, something with a history that cannot be replicated, that is true power. He paused, taking a sip of the Petrus. He didn't acknowledge Clara's presence as she refilled his glass, but his eyes flickered towards her for a fraction of a second. It was a look of utter indifference, the kind one gives to a piece of furniture. As she turned to leave, his voice, sharp as broken glass, cut through the air. "Waitress." Clara stopped her back to him. Her heart began to pound, a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She turned slowly. "Sir." His eyes roamed over her, not with interest, but with critical assessment, as if looking for a flaw in a product. "Your name?" "Clara, sir." "Clara," he repeated, letting the name hang in the air, as if tasting it for imperfections. "Your posture is adequate. You move quietly. This is good. It shows you understand your function." It wasn't a compliment. It was a classification. She was a tool performing its function correctly. Clara simply nodded, her jaw tight. "Thank you, sir." "Do not thank me," he said, his voice turning cold. "Thank your manager for training you properly. Competence is expected, not praised. You may go." Clara walked away, her hands trembling slightly. She could feel every eye in the restaurant on her, a mixture of pity and relief that it wasn't them. She returned to her station, her face a neutral mask, but inside a storm was gathering. She had seen true masterpieces in museums, paintings filled with the soul and struggle of the artist. She had studied the lives of men and women who created legacies of beauty and thought. And then there was Damian al-Jamil, a man who spoke of authenticity, but was to her discerning eye the most hollow man she had ever seen. He collected things, but he understood nothing. And it was that hollowness, that fraudulent claim to a world he only owned, but could never truly appreciate, that would soon become his undoing. An hour later, the main courses had been served and cleared. The atmosphere at table 1 had shifted. The business talk was over, and Damien had moved on to his favorite topic himself and the magnificent tapestry of his acquisitions. He was holding court, his voice now imbued with a performative passion designed to awe the senator and anyone else within earshot. The subject was his latest prize, a painting he was in the final stages of acquiring through a private auction. It was The Last Voyage of the Albatross, a long-lost masterpiece by the 19th century maritime painter Julian Croft. The art world was buzzing about its resurfacing after nearly a century in a sealed Swiss vault. Croft was a master of light, but not in the way of Turner. Damien pontificated, swirling a post-dinner brandy in a large snifter. Turner's light was divine chaotic. Croft's, his was a light of grim reality. It was the cold, unforgiving light of the North Atlantic, the kind that reflects off icebergs just before they tear a hole in a ship's hull. Senator Thorne nodded along his expression, one of rapt attention, though it was clear he knew nothing about art. Incredible Damien. Truly. The Albatross is his magnum opus. Damien continued, his voice resonating with an owner's pride. It depicts the final moments of the eponymous ship caught in a tempest. But the genius is in the detail. Everyone focuses on the storm, the waves like jagged mountains. But they miss the key. In the lower left corner, almost hidden in the seafoam, Croft painted a small, discarded doll floating in the water. It's a symbol of the innocence lost to the merciless ambition of the sea. It is that single, heart-breaking detail that elevates it from a mere painting to a profound statement on man's futility. He leaned back, a smug smile playing on his lips. The so-called experts at Sotheby's and Christie's, they all missed it in their initial analyses. I was the one who spotted it from the digital prospectus. It's what convinced me I had to have it. An eye for detail. Marcus is everything. At her station, Clara froze. Every muscle in her body went rigid. The glass she was polishing stopped midway through its rotation. A doll in the lower left corner. Her mind raced. She had just written a 15-page paper on Julian Croft for her Masters of 19th Century Realism seminar. Croft was her obsession. She knew his catalogue raisonné by heart. She had spent weeks analysing his brushwork, his thematic obsessions, his subtle signatures. The last voyage of the Albatross was famous precisely because its history was so mysterious, but its composition was known through preliminary sketches and a single grainy photograph from a 1928 exhibition catalogue. And Clara knew, with the kind of unshakable certainty that comes from hundreds of hours of dedicated study, that there was no doll. Croft's symbolism was never so literal, so much sentimental. His work was about the brutal, unsentimental power of nature. He painted ropes, broken masts, and the cold, indifferent sea. The heartbreaking detail in The Last Voyage, according to the leading Croft scholar, Professor Alistair Finch, was far more subtle. It was a single seabird, an albatross flying away from the sinking ship, not towards it, symbolizing nature, abandoning man to his fate. The bird was in the upper right corner, often mistaken for a simple brushstroke against the dark clouds. Damien al-Jamil was wrong. And not just wrong, but confidently, arrogantly wrong. He hadn't discovered a hidden detail. He had invented one. He had concocted a story to make himself sound more perceptive, more brilliant than the experts, to bolster his narrative of being the man who sees what others miss. Clara's blood ran cold, then hot. It was one thing for him to be cruel to the staff. It was another for him to desecrate the work of an artist she revered, to twist its meaning to serve his own bloated ego. It was a lie wrapped in a veneer of culture, a forgery of intellectualism. She looked over at table 1. Damien was laughing now, accepting the senator's fawning praise. He looked invincible, a king on his throne, dispensing what he believed to be wisdom. To challenge him would be professional suicide. Frank would fire her on the spot, and Damien would likely ensure she never worked in a service job in New York again. It could even affect her standing at Pratt if he decided to extend his influence there. A man like him surely had a name on a building or two. Her mind was a battlefield. One voice, the voice of survival, screamed at her to stay quiet, to let it go. It wasn't her business. She was just a waitress. Her opinion was worthless here. But another voice, the voice of the art historian, the voice that believed in truth and beauty and the integrity of an artist's vision, whispered back. He is lying. He is defiling Croft's legacy for his own vanity. And no one in this room has the knowledge or the courage to stop him. She thought of Julian Croft, a man who died penniless and obscure, who poured his entire soul onto his canvases, seeking only to capture a harsh and beautiful truth. And now, over a century later, this barbarian was using his masterpiece as a prop in his personal theater of power. Maria bumped her shoulder gently. "You okay, Clara?" "You look like you've seen a ghost." Clara looked from Maria's worried face to Damien's triumphant one. In that moment, a quiet, steely resolve settled in her chest. It wasn't about being brave. It was about respect. Respect for her studies, for her passion for the dead artist who couldn't defend himself. She placed the wine glass down on the polished counter with a soft, definitive click. She straightened her apron, took a deep breath, and began to walk towards table 1. She had no plan, no grand strategy. She only had the truth, and she was about to find out if that was enough. As Clara approached the table, the world seemed to slow down. The ambient chatter of the restaurant faded into a dull roar, and the light seemed to converge on the crimson booth where the lion held court. Frank caught her eye from across the room, his expression a frantic mask of horror and confusion, silently pleading with her to turn back. But Clara's gaze was fixed on Damien Al-Jamil. She stopped, not beside him, but a respectful few feet from the edge of the table, ensuring she wasn't looming. She waited for a pause in the conversation, a small pocket of silence she could step into without being overtly disruptive. The moment came when Damien took another sip of his brandy. "Excuse me, Mr. Al-Jamil," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it was clear and steady, cutting through the air with surprising authority. Damien lowered his glass, his eyebrows knitting together in annoyance. He didn't look at her, but at Senator Thorne, as if to say, "Can you believe the audacity? I did not summon you," he said, his voice flat and cold. "I know, sir. I apologize for the interruption." Clara said, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was it, the point of no return. "I couldn't help but overhear your commentary on Julian Croft's The Last Voyage of the Albatross. I am a great admirer of his work." A flicker of surprise registered on Damien's face. He seemed momentarily intrigued by the novelty of it, like a king finding a talking mouse. "Is that so?" he said, a condescending smirk touching his lips. "And what does a waitress know of Julian Croft? I'm studying his work at the Pratt Institute," Clara stated, simply refusing to be baited. "My thesis is on the symbolic use of fauna in his later period." The senator shifted uncomfortably. This was not part of the script. "How fascinating," Damien said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Do you have a point, or are you just seeking a commendation on your extracurricular activities?" "I have a point, sir," Clara said, meeting his gaze directly now. The full force of his intimidating presence washed over her, but she held her ground. "You mentioned a detail in the painting, a doll in the lower left corner symbolizing lost innocence." "I did," Damien said, his eyes narrowing. "A detail that escaped the so-called experts, a testament to a keen eye." He was daring her, practically begging her to contradict him so he could crush her. "I'm afraid there might be some mistake, sir," Clara said, her voice remaining perfectly level and respectful. "All existing scholarship, including Croft's own preliminary sketches held at the National Maritime Museum, indicates that the key symbolic detail in that painting is not a doll." The silence at the table was now absolute. Even the clatter from the kitchen seemed to have ceased. Senator Thorne looked as if he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. Damien placed his brandy snifter down on the table with a loud, deliberate thud. The smile was gone, replaced by a mask of cold fury. "A mistake," he repeated, his voice dangerously soft. "Are you a part-time waitress, standing here and telling me that I am mistaken?" "I am saying that the historical record and the artist's known thematic tendencies do not support the presence of a doll," Clara clarified, choosing her words with surgical precision. The detail scholars have long identified as Croft's statement on futility, as you so eloquently put it, is the lone albatross in the upper right corner flying away from the wreck. It signifies nature's indifference, a theme consistent throughout his oeuvre. A doll would be uncharacteristically sentimental for Croft. Every word was a hammer blow to Damien's carefully constructed facade. She wasn't just saying he was wrong. She was explaining why he was wrong, using the language of art history, a language he had only pretended to speak. She was exposing him as a fraud in the very arena he had chosen for his display of superiority. For a moment, Damien Al-Jamil looked utterly stunned. His air of invincibility evaporated, replaced by the raw, naked shock of a man who had never been challenged, let alone corrected, especially not by someone he considered less than human. Then the shock curdled into rage, a deep, venomous rage that made his face pale and his knuckles white as he gripped the table. "You are insolent!" He hissed the words, tight and controlled, yet more menacing than any shout. "You think your little night school class gives you the right to question me?" "It's not about my rights," Clara replied, her own fear now replaced by a strange sense of calm. She had spoken the truth, and the consequences no longer mattered as much as that fact. "It's about the artist's work, the truth of the painting." "The truth?" Damien laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Let me teach you a lesson about the truth, little girl. The truth is what I say it is. The truth is that I am in the process of paying $30 million for that canvas. When it is in my possession, if I say it has a dancing monkey in the corner, then it will have a dancing monkey. Its story will be the one I choose to tell." He stood up, his tall frame looming over her. "And you have just told your last story in this establishment. You're fired." He turned his venomous gaze on Frank, who was now rushing towards the table, his face ashen. "Frank, get this thing out of my sight, and have her final paycheck delivered to my office. I will personally deduct the cost of my ruined evening from it." Frank grabbed Clara's arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "Miss Evans, come with me. Now." He was pulling her away, trying to de-escalate to save his restaurant. But Clara had one last shot to fire. She looked past Frank directly at Damien Al-Jamil. "You can buy the canvas, sir," she said, her voice ringing out in the silent restaurant. "But you can't buy the truth of what it is. And a lie, no matter how much you pay for it, is always ultimately ridiculous." The word hung in the air. Ridiculous. It was the perfect word. It didn't just label him a liar. It labeled him a fool, a rich, powerful, but ultimately ridiculous man, playing dress-up as a connoisseur. The blood drained from Damien's face, then returned in a furious, mottled flush. He looked for the first time not like a lion, but like a bully on a playground who had just been publicly shamed. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He had been so thoroughly dismantled, his intellectual authority so completely undermined, that his usual weapons of wealth and intimidation were useless. Senator Thorne stared down at his plate, suddenly fascinated by the pattern on the porcelain. Everyone in the restaurant was frozen, watching the unbelievable spectacle. As Frank finally managed to hustle Clara towards the kitchen doors, a new sound entered the room. It was a soft chuckle. A low, appreciative laugh came from a corner table where a quiet, elderly gentleman named Mr. Arthur Peterson had been dining alone, watching the entire exchange with keen, intelligent eyes. The laugh, though quiet, was a spark in the powder keg of Damien Al-Jamil's humiliation. It was the sound of his authority not just being challenged, but being mocked. And in that moment, the feared Damian al-Jamil looked utterly, completely, and undeniably ridiculous. The kitchen doors swung shut behind them, and the hushed drama of the dining room was replaced by the chaotic symphony of a busy restaurant kitchen. The clatter of pans, the hiss of the grill, and the shouts of chefs seemed a world away from the icy confrontation that had just occurred. Frank let go of Clara's arm, his face a jumble of fury, fear, and a sliver of disbelief. "What in God's name were you thinking, Clara?" he hissed, his voice trembling. "Do you have any idea who that is? That's not just a rich customer. That's Damian al-Jamil. He could buy this building and have it torn down for a parking lot by tomorrow morning if he felt like it." "He was lying, Frank," Clara said, her own adrenaline starting to recede, leaving a shaky emptiness in its wake. "I don't care if he said the sky was green with purple polka dots," Frank exclaimed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "You work here. Your job is to pour water, take orders, and smile. Your job is not to give art history lectures to men who could end your career with a single phone call. You're fired. I have no choice. You have to go. Now." Clara nodded slowly. She had known this was the inevitable outcome. "I understand." She turned and walked to the staff locker room, her legs feeling like lead. The other waitstaff averted their eyes, whispering amongst themselves. She was no longer one of them. She was a cautionary tale. She quickly changed out of her uniform and into her street clothes, jeans, and a simple sweater. As she gathered her belongings, the weight of her actions finally crashed down on her. She hadn't just lost a job. She had provoked a monster. Frank's words echoed in her mind. What if Damian didn't stop at just getting her fired? She walked out the back alley entrance, the cold night air a shock to her system. The city lights of New York seemed to mock her, a glittering paradise she had just been exiled from. She had stood up for her principles, but what good were principles if she couldn't pay her rent or afford her tuition? Doubt began to creep in, cold and sharp. "Miss Evans." The voice was calm and cultured, and it came from the shadows of the alley. Clara jumped, spinning around to see the elderly gentleman from the corner table. It was Mr. Peterson, the man who had laughed. He was impeccably dressed in an old but well-maintained tweed jacket and held a classic wooden cane, though he didn't seem to need it for support. His eyes behind thick-lensed glasses were bright, with an intelligence that reminded her of one of her favorite professors. "Mr. Peterson," she said, surprised. He was a quiet regular, always reading a book, always polite. He seemed so out of place in this grimy alley. "Arthur, please," he said with a small, wry smile. "I wanted to offer you my compliments. What you did there. I haven't seen anything that brave in a very, very long time." "Brave or stupid," Clara muttered, pulling her coat tighter around herself. "I just lost my job." "You did more than that," Arthur Peterson said, his smile fading into a more serious expression. "You exposed Damian al-Jamil for what he is, a hollow man, a fraud, and you did it publicly. He will never forgive you for that." This wasn't comforting. "Thank you for the vote of confidence," she said wryly. "It wasn't meant to be," he replied. "It was a warning. I know him, you see. Better than most. I know what he is capable of." Clara looked at him, truly looked at him for the first time. There was a deep-seated weariness in his face, a history of pain behind the sharp eyes. "How do you know him?" Arthur Peterson sighed, tapping his cane softly on the broken pavement. "My family used to own a publishing house, Peterson and Sons. We specialized in academic texts, art history books, poetry. It was my grandfather's legacy. We weren't a massive conglomerate, but we were respected. We published the first definitive guide to Julian Croft's work, In Fact, Alistair Finch's seminal text. Clara's eyes widened. I've read it. It's the Bible for Croft scholars. It was, Arthur said with a sad smile. 5 years ago, Al-Jamil decided he wanted to enter the media world. He staged a hostile takeover of Peterson and Sons. He didn't want our legacy or our authors. He wanted our real estate in Midtown and our distribution network. He bought the company, gutted it, sold off the assets, and fired everyone. My family's work of 3 generations erased in less than 6 months. He called it streamlining for the new media landscape. I called it vandalism. The pieces clicked into place for Clara. Mr. Peterson wasn't just a spectator. He was a casualty. His quiet dinners at Aurelia, a restaurant frequented by his destroyer, suddenly seemed less like a coincidence and more like a vigil. I'm so sorry, she said the words, feeling inadequate. Don't be, he said, his gaze hardening. Be prepared. He won't be content with you losing your job. The humiliation you dealt him tonight was profound. He will see it as a debt, and his debts are always paid with interest. He will try to ruin you, Miss Evans. He'll look into your school, your finances, your family. He will find a pressure point and squeeze until you break. A wave of real fear, colder and deeper than any she had felt before, washed over Clara. This was no longer about a lost job. This was about her entire life. What can I do? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Arthur Peterson looked up and down the dark alley, then back at her. A new light had entered his eyes, not just intelligence, but the glint of a long-dormant fighting spirit. For 5 years I have watched that man operate with impunity, he said, his voice low and intense. I have been a ghost, a relic of a company he devoured. But tonight, you reminded me that even the most formidable predator can be made to look foolish. You found a chink in his armor. Not his finances, not his political connections, but his ego, his fraudulent intellectualism. He stepped closer, his expression resolute. You cannot fight him on his terms. You don't have the money or the power. But you have something he doesn't: authenticity. The very thing he pretends to value. You have the truth. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a simple business card. It was old and elegant, with embossed lettering, Arthur Peterson, Peterson and Sons Publishing. The name was definitely uncrossed out. He thinks this is over, Arthur said. He thinks you are a fly he has swatted. He will move to acquire his painting, to erase tonight's embarrassment with the sheer force of his wealth. But we are not going to let him. You and I, Miss Evans, are going to give Mr. Al-Jamil a proper lesson in art history. We are going to take your truth and turn it into a weapon he never sees coming. Clara looked down at the card in her hand, then backed up at the determined old man. An hour ago she was a waitress. Now she was unemployed, a target, and an ally. She was terrified, but for the first time since she had walked away from that table, she wasn't alone. Okay, Arthur, she said, her voice finding its strength again. What do we do first? Damien. Al-Jamil was not a man who tolerated humiliation. He processed it, converted it into a cold, hard fuel for revenge, and then executed that revenge with the methodical brutality of a state-sponsored demolition. The laughter of Arthur Peterson had been the spark, but Clara's final word, ridiculous, was the inferno that now burned within him. The morning after the incident at Aurelia, the siege began. It was not a physical siege with battering rams, but a modern corporate one, far more insidious and devastating. The first salvo was aimed at the restaurant itself. By 9:00 a.m., Frank Marino received a call from the holding company that owned the building on Park Avenue. Their largest shareholder, a previously anonymous offshore entity, had been bought out overnight. The new majority owner was a company named Jamil Global Holdings. An emergency board meeting was called. The agenda a review of the lease agreement with a tenant named Aurelia, which was reportedly suffering from a decline in service standards. Frank felt a cold dread creep up his spine. Damien wasn't just tearing down the parking lot, he was buying the whole street to do it. The second salvo was a targeted media strike. By lunchtime, a notorious gossip columnist for the New York Post, a man well known for being on Damien's payroll, published a blind item: which high-end eatery is letting its unhinged staff accost and insult its most valued patrons. Seems one waitress with delusions of grandeur decided to trade her tip tray for a soapbox, leading to a shocking display that has the city's elite thinking twice about their reservations. It was vague, but for those in the know, the message was clear. Aurelia was toxic. Bookings for the following weeks began to be cancelled in droves, but the most personal and terrifying assault was reserved for Clara. When she met Arthur at a small, anonymous coffee shop in the village that afternoon, her face was pale and her hands trembled as she held her phone. "He found me," she whispered, her voice strained. "I got an email this morning from the Dean of Students at Pratt. It was very formal. It said an anonymous complaint had been lodged against me regarding a potential violation of the Student Code of Conduct outside of university grounds. It says there's going to be an inquiry into whether my public behavior has brought the institution into disrepute." Arthur's face grew grim. An anonymous complaint from a man who is likely one of their most generous benefactors. The Al-Jamil wing of the architecture school, perhaps. Clara nodded numbly. It was dedicated 2 years ago. I didn't make the connection. They're putting my scholarship under review pending the outcome of the inquiry. My scholarship, Arthur. Without it, I can't. She trailed off, the implication hanging heavy in the air. "He's cutting you off at the knees," Arthur said, his voice tight with anger. "He's not just taking your job, he's taking your future. This is his way. He isolates his targets, severs their lifelines, and watches them wither." Clara felt a rising tide of panic. This was happening too fast. His power was immense, his reach seemingly infinite. He was a leviathan, and she was in a rowboat, frantically paddling against the tide he created. What do we do? How can we fight this? He owns everything. Not everything, Arthur said, his calm a stark contrast to her panic. He took a sip of his tea, his eyes thoughtful. He doesn't own the past. He doesn't own the truth. Right now, he is reacting with pure wounded pride. He's using a sledgehammer to kill a fly. But his focus is still on the prize that caused all this trouble, the painting. He slid a copy of an Art World journal across the table. The headline read, "Al-Jamil nears acquisition of Lost Croft masterpiece." The private auction, hosted by a boutique firm named Elysian Heritage Auctions, was set for the end of the week. "This is his next move," Arthur explained. "He will publicly purchase the last voyage of the Albatross for a record-breaking sum. He will then magnanimously loan it to a museum, perhaps the Met. And when the museum displays it, the plaque will read, 'On loan from the collection of Damien Al-Jamil,' and the description will of course mention the profound, previously undiscovered detail of the floating doll. He will literally rewrite art history to erase his humiliation. He will make his lie the official truth, and your correction will be forgotten, dismissed as the ramblings of a disgruntled waitress." Clara stared at the magazine, at the smirking photo of Damien Al-Jamil beside the article. He was creating his own reality, and he had the money to force everyone else to live in it. The sheer arrogance of it was breathtaking. "So we can't let him get the painting," Clara said, a new resolve hardening her voice. "Bidding against him is impossible," Arthur countered. "He'd pay $1 billion for it, just to prove a point. No, we cannot stop the sale. But we can change the story." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You said yourself, a doll is uncharacteristically sentimental for Croft. It's a clumsy, obvious piece of symbolism. Why did Al-Jamil invent that specific lie? Why not something more plausible, a hidden signature, a face in the clouds? Why a doll?" Clara frowned, considering it for the first time. "I don't know, it's amateurish. It's the kind of detail someone with no real understanding of art would think is profound." "Exactly," Arthur said, his eyes gleaming. "It's a mistake, an unforced error, and in my experience, men like Damien Al-Jamil don't make mistakes without a reason. Their ego is usually too polished. This lie feels personal. It came from somewhere deep inside him. It wasn't just a random boast. It was a story he needed to tell." A new path forward began to illuminate in Clara's mind, pushing back the shadows of fear. They couldn't fight his money or his influence. The siege was unwinnable on his terms. But they could become detectives. They could investigate the lie itself. "So we don't focus on Damien," Clara said, thinking aloud. "We focus on the painting, and we focus on the doll. We need to find out everything we can about the last voyage, its history, its ownership, its journey through the last century." "Precisely," Arthur affirmed. "His power is in the present. He controls the media, the markets, the politicians. But the past is a foreign country, and its borders are not so easily controlled. We need to find something in the painting's history that contradicts his narrative in a way he cannot bury." The siege was on. Damien was bombarding them with all the power of his modern empire. But Clara and Arthur were preparing a counterattack, not with weapons of wealth, but with dusty books, forgotten archives, and the unshakable conviction that somewhere hidden in the long and silent history of a single painting lay a truth that could bring a giant to his knees. Their investigation had begun. The next few days were a blur of frantic clandestine research. While Damien's lawyers were tightening the screws on Pratt and finalizing the paperwork to evict Aurelia Clara, and Arthur established a makeshift headquarters in the back room of Arthur's dusty, book-filled apartment on the Upper West Side. It was a war room papered not with battle plans, but with photocopied auction records, museum catalogues, and timelines scribbled on a large whiteboard. They operated on the assumption that Damien's lie about the doll was not random. It was a psychological fingerprint left at the scene of the crime. Their mission was to uncover the origin of that fingerprint. Their first breakthrough came from the archives of Peterson & Sons Publishing. Arthur still had copies of nearly every book his family had ever printed. In a long-forgotten crate, they found the original research files for Professor Finch's book on Julian Croft, including correspondence from the 1970s. "Listen to this," Arthur said, reading from a fragile typewritten letter. It was from a retired art restorer in Liverpool who had claimed his grandfather worked as a dockhand for the shipping company that first owned the painting in the 1890s. He writes, "My grandfather always told a story about the big Croft painting. said the shipping magnate who commissioned it, a Mr. Blackwood, hated the final piece. I called it morbid, but Blackwood's young daughter Elara adored it. She would sit in front of it for hours. Grandad said she even gave the ship a little toy to keep it company on its sad voyage. Clara looked up from her laptop, her eyes wide. A toy. He doesn't say what kind of toy. No, just a little toy, Arthur said, his excitement palpable. But the name, Elara, it's an old name. Almost like Clara. He gave her a meaningful look. The connection was tenuous, a ghost of a whisper across a century. But it was the first time anything resembling a child's plaything had been associated with the painting. Still, it wasn't a doll painted onto the canvas. It was something external, a child's game. Their next step was tracing the painting's provenance, its chain of ownership. After the Blackwood family's shipping empire went bankrupt in the early 20th century, their assets were liquidated. The last voyage of the Albatross was sold in a chaotic estate auction in 1928. This was where the official record, the one Damien and the auction house relied on, got murky. The painting was listed as sold to a private European collector and then vanished into a Swiss vault only to reappear now. The auction records from that time are a mess, Clara said, scrolling through digitized pages of a yellowed 1928 ledger. Most sales are just listed with a surname, Smith Dubois Cohen. It could be anyone. Damien's people will have done their due diligence, but only as far as they needed to establish a clear title for the sale, Arthur reasoned. They wouldn't dig for stories. They'd only dig for legal ownership. We need to dig for the human element. For 2 days, they cross-referenced the surnames from the auction ledger with immigration records, ship passenger lists, and census data from the period. It was a painstaking needle-in-a-haystack search. Clara's art history training had made her a meticulous researcher, able to spend hours sifting through dry data for a single, shining detail. Late on the third night, fueled by stale coffee and sheer determination, she found it. "Arthur," she whispered, her voice hoarse with fatigue and excitement. "Come look at this." On the screen was a passenger manifest for the SS Majestic, which sailed from Southampton to New York in April 1929. One name on the third-class passenger list stood out: Jamil Elias. Under occupation, it listed carpenter. He was traveling with his wife and their young son. Jamil. Arthur breathed, leaning closer. It could be a coincidence. Maybe, Clara said, her fingers flying across the keyboard. But the ledger from the Blackwood auction, there's a sale entry for a large, unnamed maritime painting to a buyer listed only as Jamil. The price was £50, a huge sum for a carpenter, but not an impossible one if it was his life savings. A carpenter from Lebanon buying a massive oil painting of a sinking British ship, Arthur mused. It makes no sense as an art investment. It must have been for personal reasons. Clara's mind was racing, connecting the dots. What if Elias Jamil was one of the thousands of migrant workers who passed through Liverpool's docks? What if he worked there just like the art restorer's grandfather? What if he saw the painting, heard the stories about the little girl, Elara, who loved it? They kept digging now with a name and a new direction. They scoured New York City archives. They found Elias Jamil in the 1930 census, living in a crowded tenement on the Lower East Side. He worked as a cabinet maker, a skilled tradesman. But then tragedy. His wife died in 1932. Elias struggled as a single father during the Great Depression. The records showed he sold off possessions to make ends meet. In 1934, there was a pawn shop record for the sale of one large painting in ornate frame for the pitiful sum of $20. The buyer was a minor art dealer who a few years later sold his entire collection to a Swiss financier. That was how it ended up in the vault. The final piece of the puzzle, the one that made Clara's blood run cold, came from a small digitized newspaper clipping from a local community paper in 1934. It was a brief human interest story about the struggles of immigrants during the Depression. It featured a short interview with Elias Jamil. Clara read the key passage aloud, her voice trembling. "It is hard," the carpenter Mr. Jamil said through a translator. "I must sell everything, even the picture. My son, he cries. He loves the picture of the big ship. When he was a baby, his mother made him a small rag doll. He would hold the doll up to the glass and say, 'Don't be scared. She will ride the waves with you.'" The article ended there. Silence descended on the small room, thick and heavy with the weight of history. There it was, the Achilles heel, the origin of the lie. The doll wasn't in the painting. The doll was in the story, a family story, a story of poverty loss and a father's love. Damien al-Jamil hadn't invented the detail out of thin air. He had dredged it up from a memory he had likely suppressed for his entire life. He wasn't the descendant of Arab merchant princes. He was the grandson of Elias Jamil, a poor carpenter from the Lower East Side. The painting wasn't just a status symbol. It was the last remnant of a past he had spent his entire fortune trying to erase. His desperate attempt to reclaim it wasn't about art. It was about his own history. But in his arrogance, he had conflated a treasured family memory with the physical reality of the canvas. He had projected his own childhood onto the painting and in his hubris declared his personal story to be a universal hidden truth of the artwork. "My God," Arthur whispered, sinking into a chair. "He's not just a liar. He's a man at war with himself. He despises his own humble origins so much that he's created this entire fantasy of being old money, of being a connoisseur by birthright. Buying this painting is his way of finally conquering his own past, of owning the story, instead of being owned by it." Clara looked at the whiteboard at the timeline of a family's struggle. The siege suddenly felt different. They weren't just fighting a corporate titan. They were fighting a man's deepest, most painful secret. "The auction is tomorrow," Clara said. "He's going to buy it, and he's going to cement his lie into history. Perhaps," Arthur said, a slow, strategic smile spreading across his face, "but a story can be a powerful weapon, and we now have the true one. He wants to be the one who tells the painting's story fine. Let's give him the stage, and then let's give him the ending he never saw coming." The Elysian Heritage Auction was meant to be Damien al-Jamil's coronation. Held in a private salon at the Pierre Hotel, the room was a fortress of quiet money. At the front, the last voyage of the Albatross rested under a perfect spotlight, its dark, churning waves waiting for their new owner. Damien sat in the front row, holding paddle number 1. His victory was a foregone conclusion. The bidding was a brief formality. As the price climbed past 20 million other collectors, demurred, unwilling to challenge a man, bidding with the full force of his ego. 30 million. Damien stated his voice calm and clear, not even bothering to wait for the auctioneer. It was a declaration, not a bid. Silence. "Sold," the auctioneer announced to Mr. Damien al-Jamil. Polite applause followed. Damien gave a regal nod as reporters invited by his own team swarmed him. This was the moment He'd engineered the moment to cement his lie into history. "Mr. Al-Jamil, what does this masterpiece mean to you?" a reporter from the Wall Street Journal asked. "It represents the triumph of a discerning eye." Damien began, his voice smooth as silk. "For decades, its deepest secret went unnoticed. Experts saw only a storm. But I saw its heart, a small detail of a child's doll lost in the waves, a profound symbol of—" "Excuse me." The voice, clear and steady, cut through the salon. The crowd turned. Standing at the back of the room were Clara Evans and Arthur Peterson. They hadn't been invited, but they were here. Damien's face froze, his triumph instantly souring into cold fury. "Security," he snapped. "Remove them." "We just came to congratulate you, Damien," Arthur called out, his voice surprisingly strong. "And to thank you. Your interest in the painting inspired us to uncover its true story. It's a wonderful American immigrant story." The reporters, sensing a far better headline, pivoted their cameras and microphones, swinging toward Clara and Arthur. The security guards paused, caught in the middle. Clara stepped forward, her eyes locked on Damien. "The painting wasn't brought to this country by a wealthy collector," she said, her voice ringing with the authority of fact. "It was brought here in 1929 by a carpenter from Lebanon named Elias Jamil." A gasp went through the room. Damien's face went white. "He was your grandfather," Clara continued, pressing the truth into the silence. "He bought it with his life savings because his young son, your father, loved the painting. That little boy had a rag doll his mother made him, and he would hold it up to the glass. There is no doll in the painting, Mr. Al-Jamil. The doll was in your father's hand. It was a beautiful family memory that you twisted into a lie to build a false identity for yourself." She held up a folder. "We have it all. The ship's manifest with your grandfather's name. The pawn shop receipt from 1934, when he sold it for $20. The local newspaper article where he spoke of his son's love for the painting." She didn't yell. She simply presented the truth. In an instant, Damien's grand narrative shattered. The descendant of merchant princes was revealed to be the grandson of a poor carpenter. His $30 million purchase was no longer a trophy. It was a monument to his own shame. The titan of industry looked small, a man terrified of his own humble past. He didn't rage. He didn't speak. All the fight drained out of him. He stared at the painting of the storm-tossed ship, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he turned and walked out of the room, past the flashing cameras and shocked faces, a hollowed-out man finally conquered by the one thing he could never buy: the truth. The story of Damien Al-Jamil's public unraveling became a legend in New York's elite circles. The lie was more damaging than any financial scandal could ever be. His carefully crafted aura of infallibility was gone, replaced by the pitying whispers about the man who was ashamed of his own grandfather. His empire didn't crumble overnight, but its foundation was cracked. Deals became harder, rivals grew bolder, and the fear he once commanded was replaced with a quiet, knowing contempt. Clara Evans, with Arthur Peterson's help, not only had her scholarship at Pratt reinstated, but was offered a full fellowship, funded by an anonymous donor, who many suspected was a rival of Damien's, delighted by his fall. Aurelia survived, with Frank Marino developing a newfound respect for his staff. The truth of the painting, the story of Elias Jamil, became its official history, a testament to an immigrant's dream. Clara showed the world that true power isn't measured in dollars or skyscrapers. It's found in the courage to speak the truth, the integrity to honor the past, and the simple fact that no lie, no matter how grand, can withstand the quiet force of one person who knows the real story. If you were moved by Clara's courage and the incredible power of the truth, please hit that like button and share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell so you never miss another tale of the underdog taking on the giants. What did you think of Damien's downfall? Let us know in the comments below. We believe in the power of stories, and with your support, we can continue to bring them to you. Thank you for watching.